Hello and welcome to the screencast. This is Hendershott-Kraetzer in the Department of Humanities at Olivet College, and this is the second in a series of screencasts making up Rhetoric, a Partial History. The purpose of these screencasts is to provide an overview of rhetoric, to give a look at the major rhetorical movements and figures within rhetoric, and to give some fundamental ideas about the nature and practice of rhetoric. Today we're on to part 2, which is an overview of the major periods of rhetoric and a look at Aristotle and some basics of Aristotelian rhetoric. What we did in our previous presentation is we looked at some definitions of rhetoric, we did some examples of rhetoric in action, some brief rhetorical analyses, and we looked at the difference between rhetoric and arhetoric. Today, we are looking at the major periods of rhetoric. We're going to do a brief overview of those, and then we're going to start in on classical rhetoric by looking at the 4 major classical traditions, by giving a more detailed look at Aristotle, his rhetoric, and what he saw as the difference between rhetoric and dialectic, and then a look at the sophists. There are lots of periods and schools of rhetoric. Because this is an introductory level series of presentations, I'm whacking the entire history into 6 big hunks rather than deal with a lot of kind of fine delineations and things like that. So as I'm going, do be aware that there are other ways that you can divide up rhetoric historically, either label them differently or give them more divisions, fewer divisions, discuss them in different ways. This is not a matter of necessarily settled discussion, but this is kind of a good thumbnail overview of rhetoric from ancient days until now. In order, the 6 periods of rhetoric that I'm presenting to you are the classical period, which is Greek and Roman, early Christian rhetoric, which is roughly the 4th century CE or AD, depending on how you want to call that. There's an interruption during the Dark Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire of about 500 years. There is the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, medieval and Renaissance rhetoric, which is roughly from the 11th to the 17th centuries. What I'm calling an Age of Suspicion, which is roughly the 18th and 19th centuries. This is a period when rhetoric and fancy speaking fell into disrepute, although when we get to that presentation we'll see that although people were skeptical of rhetoric, they still used it all the time. And then the 20th and 21st centuries, which is the period that I'm labeling the period of resurgence and reform, when rhetoric came back into the academy, came to be studied more and more intensely and a lot more deeply than it had been in the previous centuries. Okay, classical rhetoric. When I say classical, I mean big C classical. This means Greece and Rome. Just like with overall rhetoric, you can divide this up pretty much any number of ways, and there's a lot going on. So what I've done is I've divvied it up into the major traditions of schools of thought as I see them, and again, bearing in mind this is an introductory podcast. If you look at things you're going to find on the web, you'll see lots of other divisions and lots of other things going on, and that's perfectly okay. I'm building kind of a big basic pillar of knowledge here that can then be roughed up and modified and detailed as you plunge further and further into this particular subject. These traditions are the Aristotelian rhetoric, represented here by Aristotle. Ciceronian rhetoric, represented here by Cicero. The decorous tradition, which is represented here by the poet Horace. And the second sophistic, which is represented here by Herodes Atticus. You're going to see all of these guys. Again, I'm going to use these pictures as place markers as we get into these different rhetorical schools. So you'll recognize these kind of little mnemonic devices we're going along. As I said, there are other movements and other writers and other rhetoricians. These 4 are the ones most relevant to the work in our class. So don't freak out if you hear references to others as you're reading along or going along. But these should become more or less familiar to you as we go through the semester. Here's Aristotle again. You just saw him, so you know who he is. When you're talking about Aristotelian rhetoric, you are talking about Aristotle. And when you bring up rhetoric as a subject of discussion, Aristotle is going to be in the mix in some way, shape, or form. And that's either going to be directly or indirectly, because I'd say it's impossible to overstate his importance to the field. The oldest extant rhetoric is Greek. It's Aristotle's Rhetoric, or Rhetorica. If you look at the beginning of the second paragraph of the text that's on your screen right at the moment, you're going to see a couple of little phrases that indicate that there were other rhetorics running around at the time. For example, current treatises suggests other earlier texts. Other people were writing about rhetoric at the time. That's why I used the word extant when I first brought this up. That's because it's the one that we have, the oldest one that we have, that exists, that we can lay our hands on, that we can read. There almost certainly were other older rhetorics and other people were working at the same time, but this is the one that kind of grounds our knowledge at the moment. It was written in the 4th century BCE, and it's thought to be students' collected notes rather than something that was penned directly by Aristotle himself. Originally, it was 3 books. Now it's collectively called the Rhetoric. There's a lot to it. It's a big, complex book, so we're just going to be looking at a few aspects of things that are particularly relevant to an introductory level study. Aristotle divided rhetoric into 2 parts, persuasion and public speaking. Each of these has 3 parts, so we're going to be taking them in turn. As I said, persuasion is divided into 3 parts, or means. In fact, they're called the classical means of persuasion. And the first of those is persuasion by ethos. What ethos means is the character of the speaker. So I've got Gandhi representing that here because that's a great example of persuasion by character of the speaker. Because one of the things that made Gandhi effective was the moral sense of his argument, but what made him powerful was the moral force of the man. If it took going to jail, if it took getting beaten, if it took getting starved, if it took starving himself nearly to death, Gandhi would do it. And that's part of why he's known as Mahatma, great soul, even though that's not his name. A lot of people are actually surprised to find out that Mahatma isn't Gandhi's name. It was Mohandas was his first name. Ethos-based appeals are extremely effective, but there are risks to them. One of the risks is that every choice you make in every aspect of your life makes up your ethos. There are conscious choices you make, but there are unconscious ones as well. For example, in that previous presentation, I did a little bit on the rhetoric of hair and the rhetoric of clothing. Those all contribute to your ethos. Things you put on your Facebook page, the words you use in a paper, the way in which you use the words in a paper, the examples you choose, the way in which you talk about other people, the way in which you react to other people, verbally and non-verbally, all of these make up your ethos. And if you're making an ethos-based appeal and that structure fails, then the case you're making is going to fail. And that's generally why you see so many ad hominem attacks in politics, is in some ways it's easier to challenge the ethos of someone who's making a proposition, who's making a bid for your attention, than to actually challenge the argument. Because if you can tear down the person, then why would you believe anything they have to say to you? And particularly, why bother to assail a strong argument when it's easier to attack the person making it? So what does this mean for you? If you've ever made an argument based on your good character, or the appearance of good character, which in argumentative terms is kind of the same thing, you have used an ethos-based appeal. I'm a good person. I am reliable. I always do what I'm told. I listen to my mother. I clean my room. I make my bed, and things like that. That's all ethos-based stuff. It's you should agree with me because I'm a good person. And you'll note I said the appearance of good character. If you're being cynical about it, you don't actually have to have a good character. You just have to appear to have a good character. And by the same token, Machiavelli wrote about this. If it will help your argument to appear to have a bad character, to be a tyrant, then by all means appear to be a tyrant. You don't have to be a tyrant. You just have to look like it in order to get done what you want to do. Second classical means of appeal is persuasion by pathos. Pathos is the emotions of the audience. You can have all the good character or the appearance of good character in the world, but if your audience isn't moved, you're going to have a hard time carrying the day. So here's an example. It's Thanksgiving Day. You're all relaxed and happy. You're looking forward to some turkey, and that aunt you can't stand isn't coming to dinner, and you're watching the Lions, and they're winning, and so you're actually kind of happy. You know, you're in a good Thanksgiving Day mood. And then on comes a commercial of Sarah McLachlan and her sad music and the puppies with the eyes, and it goes on forever. That commercial is like 2 minutes long. And then all of a sudden you're just like, Mom, we've got to give some money to the Humane Society because of the puppies. That commercial is making a pathos-based appeal. It's making an emotional appeal to you. Most commercials actually work on emotional appeals. The best of them do them very subtly. They're presenting things that appeal to the emotions. They don't even look like they're appealing to the emotions that they actually are. They seem to be about one thing and they're actually about something else entirely. The fact of the matter is that most arguments do too, at least in some way, shape, or form. This is kind of a grisly example, but Hitler is a spectacular example of emotional appeals. He was a demagogue. He was extremely effective at getting his audience worked up using negative emotional appeals in order to get them to do what he wanted them to do. And so if you've ever tried to get someone to feel sorry for you or to empathize with your plight in order to get your way, you were using pathos in your argumentative strategies. Pathos is effective, just like ethos, but like ethos, there are risks. You can overdo it, and you can be cavalier about it. You can whip the audience into a frenzy that you can't control. It's possible for an emotional appeal to get misdirected, and so you end up with the wrong emotion, particularly if the presenter is not being careful with the cues that they are laying out. And obviously, for my Hitler example, you can appeal to negative emotions. You can get an audience happy, you can get an audience sad, or you can get them very angry, very misanthropic, misogynist, racist. You can do a lot of really, really bad things with emotional appeals. So you got your emotional appeals, your pathos set, and you're working on your ethos, your representation of your character as stalwart and forthright. What else can you do to get your audience to go where you want them to go? Well, you work through logos. Logos is difficult to translate, but broadly it means content and structure. This can include logic, but it's not only logic. And I see people do this a lot. They see logos, they think of the word logic, and so they say logos is logic. Well, that's not entirely accurate. It's okay, but it's not giving you the full picture. Logos can also be what to include and where to put it. For example, if you're talking about 9/11, I can talk about the number of people who were hurt on that day. But do I discuss deaths or do I discuss casualties, which is deaths and injury? That's a logos choice. It's how do I talk about the information that I want to talk about? How do I frame up my discussion? And then where do I put it inside my discussion? Today, in addition to the actual content, logos includes such concerns as typography, the font, the point size, the margins, color, composition, use of images, etc. So I'm using this presentation that you're looking at as an example. I picked my typography very specifically because it's been found to have certain psychological effects on readers. The point size is chosen deliberately. The color of the slides, that kind of parchmenty looking thing, again, was chosen deliberately. The composition of my slides, the images that I'm using, I've spent a fair amount of time picking ones that are hopefully interesting and useful, as well as at times amusing for you as it's going along. That's all part of my logos. Some more detail. The font that you see in the Persuasion by Logos title on this slide is Baskerville, and research has found that Baskerville is taken as more professional than other fonts. If you take the exact same text and put it in two different fonts, like Baskerville and Times New Roman, readers take the Baskerville text more seriously as being more professional than the Times New Roman one. The researchers aren't entirely clear why. They've got anecdotal evidence, reported evidence from their research group, but it was a pretty clear preference for one over the other, even though it was the exact same words. An important note, for Aristotle, a presentation didn't have to be structured or logical to demonstrate logos. It could only appear to use logic, for example. Logos can be used to mislead. Going back to my 9/11 example, I know most people understand casualties to mean fatalities, which is not accurate. Casualties is the number of people who were hurt. It's all the injured, not just those who died. So if I'm talking about casualties, my number is going to be bigger. But if I'm talking about fatalities, that's a whole other thing entirely. Using the larger number can be helpful but it might not be exactly honest with what I know people are thinking. It's not lying, but if I know the way people think and I'm using a number that is kind of misleading, then I have to kind of bear that in mind. And another question is, do I use casualties on the day, on actual 9/11 itself, or do I use long-term injuries, such as psychological injuries and pulmonary injuries that, for example, the first responders expressed in the weeks and months after 9/11? Do I use those, or do I just do on the day itself? Aristotle also was aware that logos can be used ineptly. It's there, it's just done badly. So you've got logos in your argument, it's just crappy logos. Your logos need to go away and be replaced with something better. As with persuasion, as with the means of persuasion, Aristotle used a tripartite division for the types of public speaking. The first type of public speaking is the deliberative type. This is the rhetoric of public assembly. This is for policy debate. It's for arguing for or against an action. It's represented here by a still from Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln from 2012. Here you can see the elected representatives fighting about the abolition of slavery. And this is what Aristotle meant by deliberative rhetoric. He doesn't mean, like my wife and me, talking about whether to cook or get takeout on a Friday night, or if we're doing takeout, what to get on our pizza. That's not deliberative rhetoric. Deliberative rhetoric is for weighty things, advising for and against public courses of action, essentially. The second type of public speaking is forensic or judicial rhetoric. This is the rhetoric of legal courts, prosecution and defense, guilt and innocence. Not only does this kind of rhetoric have its own special language, which you watch Law and Order or any of those shows, but it's also got rules of procedure, what does and does not constitute evidence, and so on. It's a very specialized kind of rhetoric. An example, I lived in Albion for a while I was working on my master's degree. During the winter one year, we had just a single driveway with no garage, single lane driveway, and so my wife had to get to work, so she pulled my car out and parked it. And it was a little one-way street, so it's just easier for her to back it out and park it, going actually against the flow of traffic. It was out of the way. You could get around the car. It's just pointed in the wrong direction. Later that morning, there's a knock on the door, and I answer it, and there's a cop standing there, and he gives me a ticket. And I'm like, what's the ticket for? He says, you are obstructing traffic, you're parked illegally, here's your ticket, and he said goodbye. And I was like, what the heck is going on with that? And so later on that day, I called the cops and asked him to come back for some more explanation. He did. He was very, very civil, very polite about it. He said the snowplows were out, and a snowplow driver complained because you were parked illegally, and it made him hard to get down the street. And I said, okay, and I wrote a letter to the court saying this ticket is ridiculous because it wouldn't matter which direction my car was parked. My car was parked legally at the time of day. It was just parked with its nose pointed in the wrong direction. If it was parked with its nose in the right direction, the snowplow still would have had to go around it, and that's not actually my problem. There was not a snow emergency in effect. There was no reason for this ticket to be given other than the snowplow driver was behind and was unhappy because he had to go around my car. The judge granted my request and threw the ticket out. In that letter that I wrote to the judge, I used forensic rhetoric. I looked up the local laws. I looked up what they meant. I did a little reading, and the letter itself was very, very formal. I would not have used a lot of the phrasing, and like I did with just explaining it to you right now. Because it was to the court, I had to write in a very specific way, a very formal way, using the language of the court as I understood it at the time. Even though I thought the ticket itself was stupid, my letter to the judge was very respectful, and I got my way. So yay me and yay forensic rhetoric. Third type of public speaking is epideictic, which is the rhetoric of praise and censure. It's represented here by Marlon Brando playing Mark Antony in the film Julius Caesar. This is from the forum scene, which begins, I come not to praise Caesar, but to bury him, which is a lie. Antony comes not to bury, but to praise Caesar, and at the same time to condemn the conspirators who killed him and to whip up the crowd. This speech is a spectacular example of epideictic rhetoric, so I recommend that you go and look at it sometime and listen to a good recording of it. Anytime you've engaged in some character assassination online, maybe you're trashing somebody Facebook page, or you're hacking them up on another social media forum, if you've been trashed by someone behind your back or to your face, if you've asked for a letter of recommendation, you've been engaged in some way in epideictic rhetoric, which is either saying somebody is worthy and wonderful or awful and unworthy. Aristotle didn't write just about rhetoric. Most of you probably recognize his name as a philosopher rather than as a rhetorician. Aristotle saw rhetoric as related to another presentational form that was essential to philosophy, which is dialectic. So how are they different? For Aristotle, rhetoric is practical. Its object is to persuade. And it works by means of a continuous flow of ideas from a single speaker. So like me right now, talking to you, it's just me talking. It's public. It takes place in the assembly before an audience. And it aims at an audience that's common, at everybody. And they have restricted intellectual resources, which is probably one of my favorite quotes of all time. What that means is the audience is not trained. They know what they know, but sometimes what they know is wrong. They have their opinions, and sometimes the opinions are closely held, and they're either unwilling or unable to think through more complicated things. And so sometimes you've got to use rhetoric to deal with an audience like this. So how is that different from dialectic? Dialectic, on the other hand, is philosophical. Its object is to discover truth, which is why you study and argue about a subject. Dialectic works by a process of question and answer. So you need multiple people in order to do dialectic, at least two. If you've ever read a Socratic dialogue in a world literature or in a philosophy class, you've seen dialectic in action. It's private, it's academic, and its audience is skilled, they're trained. And if you look at these two things sitting there, you could come to the conclusion that dialectic is more exalted than rhetoric in Aristotle's eyes, or that rhetoric is debased in some way, shape, or form. And that's not entirely accurate. For Aristotle, rhetoric and dialectic are related, and he presented this relationship variously depending on where you're looking at him writing about it. He saw rhetoric as a counterpart of dialectic, he saw it as an outgrowth of dialectic, and he saw it as a part of dialectic resembling it. And in fact, he saw rhetoric as essential in working with a public audience. So say you're a philosopher, say you go and you do your dialectic and you discover truth. Great, congratulations, you've got truth. But how do you communicate that truth to the public and get them to accept it? Especially if you're advocating a position that's contrary to public opinion, that's going to cause some kind of hardship for your audience, or is particularly difficult to understand. Some examples: the abolition of slavery, the Equal Rights Amendment, or marriage equality. These are all issues that, in their day, either back ago or now, cause a fair amount of intense feeling. They're hot-button issues. So you know what you think about them, or you're not sure what you think about them, and so you engage in a process of question and answering, and you eventually come to a position of truth where you think you know what's going on. You still have to talk to an audience who may not agree with you and who may be very, very profoundly irritated by what you're having to say. So you've got to use all the tools at your disposal, because your audience doesn't have full and complete knowledge, either because of ignorance or because of willful stupidity, which is being ignorant on purpose. So you need to uncork your rhetorical skills in order to get your point across to them, which is why you need to use ethos, pathos, and logos in your presentation, in your deliberative presentation, so that your audience can get to where you want them to be. So that's Aristotle, or at least the basics of him, but that's not all. It's hard to overestimate Aristotle's importance, even centrality, to the history of rhetoric, but he wasn't the only game in town in ancient Greece. There was another school of rhetoric operating at the same time, and these are known as the sophists. You remember second sophistic from when I mentioned it a little while ago. Well, if there's a second, there has to be a first, and that's who we're talking about right now. The sophists are the group that preceded the second sophistic. They're represented here by Protagoras, who was the most famous of the sophists. And these were all contemporaries of Aristotle, or they're sometimes called the pre-Socratic philosophers because they actually were working before he came along. On the surface of things, it looks like Aristotle and his crew hated the sophists. You can see that from these two passages here. And this is what making the worse appear the better argument means. Wherefore men were justly disgusted with the promise of Protagoras, for it is a lie. And the sophist is the money-making species of the eristic, disputatious, controversial, pugnacious, combative, acquisitive family. From these two things, Plato and Aristotle clearly did not appear to like sophists and what they represented. But it's a little bit complicated because much of what we know about sophists comes from people who didn't like them, who disagreed with their philosophy or with their methods. And there's not a lot of material from the sophists anyway. And what we do have is hardly complete. Almost none of it is complete, for example. So it becomes problematic about who the sophists were and what they actually stood for. And so let's have a look at that for a moment. The word sophist in English is sophistes in Greek, and sophistes means wise men. The sophistes were itinerant professional teachers of arete, which is virtue and excellence. As a group, the sophists included incredibly respected poets and philosophers. Some examples are Homer, the author of the Iliad and Odyssey, Hesiod, who was a historian. And the word itself, sophist, comes from Sophia, wisdom, and sophos, wise. It's not a group that in and of itself, on the surface, would be one that you would think would be like horribly disreputable. In fact, if you think about it, teaching virtue and excellence is something that you would want to teach. What made people kind of skeevy about the sophists was that they taught arete, virtue and excellence, but they did it for a fee. They did it for a big fee. Being an effective public speaker in 5th century Athens, which is when these guys were working, was essential. The sophists were effective teachers, and so they commanded significant coin. And I know what you're thinking. It's like, well, what's so wrong about that? If you're good at something and you're getting paid for it, how could that possibly be a bad thing? Well, they upset the apple cart of thinking at the time. They were represented as being more interested in mastering human nature than in understanding it. So you've got philosophy here, which is all noble and stuff, but then you get the sophists coming along, who are more represented as not being after truth. They're after success. They're after winning. They don't care about the nobility of philosophy. Virtue and excellence, arete, were seen as aristocratic attributes. They were attributes of the ruling class of Athens at the time. If you're teaching these things to anyone who can pay, you are eroding aristocratic privilege. And then what you're getting is a bunch of jumped-up whippersnappers using a lot of fancy-pants wordplay to get ahead in the world rather than people who actually are virtuous and excellent. And what you're doing is you're starting to equate arete with political power achieved through rhetorical hijinks rather than actual virtue. And so ultimately what you end up doing is eroding the entire culture's high-minded notions of itself. So we think we're all wonderful. But if anybody can do the stuff that equates with wonderful, then what does that mean for us and our wonderfulness? And so what happened was there was considerable backlash to the sophists and their methods as they're going along. In fact, that's ultimately what got Socrates killed. Not that he was a sophist, but that he was accusing of using sophistry, of corrupting the morals of young men, and he was given the death penalty at the time. But as I said, it's complicated. Aristotle didn't seem to hold the sophists in particularly high regard, but he doesn't treat them any worse than any other group of philosophers or rhetoricians that he chooses to comment on. So his presentation of them seems more or less like he presents his presentation about any other group that he saw as having different opinions or different beliefs or different systems than he used. Plato, follower of Aristotle, couldn't stand the sophists, but his dislike seemed to be as much personal as it is professional, obviously because his teacher was Socrates, and Socrates was accused of sophistry and executed. He's going to have some personal baggage about that, and because their method challenges his method, kind of goes against the way he thought things should be done, there's also a professional dispute. So you always have to wonder about somebody who's opposing you for reasons not entirely grounded in altruism. At the same time, he presents the most famous sophist, Protagoras, as sympathetic and dignified. He doesn't agree with him, but he doesn't trash the guy's reputation or his ethos. So you wonder exactly what's going on there. Aristophanes wrote a play that mocked the sophists ruthlessly, but it's a play, it's a satire, and whatever truth there might be in satire, you also can't take it as an objective representation of fact. That would be like taking the Colbert Report as an actual news show. I know some people do that. You can learn things from the Colbert Report or from Jon Stewart's Daily Show, certainly, but those are not actual news shows. They're there for entertainment. They're there with their political view, and you kind of have to filter that as you're looking at what they represent as facts to make sure that there are actual facts there and that you're going to trust them. Pericles, who was an incredibly influential and respected Athenian general and statesman, held sophists in high regard, and he actually had Protagoras draft laws for a new city. So if one of your most respected politicians is using the sophists to draft laws for a new city that he himself is personally setting up, then you got to wonder about how bad the sophists were actually. As I said before, there's not actually a lot from the sophists themselves, so it's hard to see how they took this dispute. And the dislike by the Aristotelians may in fact have been overstated in the past. Recent scholarship is calling this feud into question. So you have to ask, how much can you trust the opposition to represent the other side fairly and accurately? If I'm going to run down an opponent, I'm not going to be fair and balanced in my presentation. But the problem with that is that the more the scholars are looking at the original materials, the more they're finding lots of these gray areas, like I've been talking about, with Aristotle being kind of balanced in this presentation and Plato having what appears to be mixed feelings about the movement versus individuals within the movement, and respected individuals having high opinion of other people within the philosophical movement called sophistry. So here we are at the end of our presentation. So let's sum up and see what we've looked at. We've looked at 6 major periods of rhetoric. We've looked at 4 major movements within classical rhetoric, 5 actually, if you include the sophists. We've introduced Aristotle and the rhetoric to you, including the 3 classical means of persuasion, ethos, pathos, logos, the 3 types of public speaking, deliberative, forensic, and epideictic. We've looked at the difference between rhetoric and dialectic, and we've had a bonus look at the sophists themselves, which is, I think, a kind of a busy afternoon for you guys looking at this thing. Where are we going next? Next presentation, we're going to continue with classical rhetoric by looking at Cicero and Ciceronian rhetoric. We'll have a closer look at deliberative, judicial, and epideictic rhetoric. We'll look at the stages of development of a speech or paper as Cicero laid them out. And we'll look at the 3 levels or types of style as Cicero laid them out. So we're going to get into more detail about who you write to, how you write to them, the way in which you choose to write about them, how you go about putting your thing together. After that, we will move on and continue with our classical rhetoric by looking at the decorous and the second sophistic traditions. So that's it for this time. I'd like to thank you for your time and kind attention, and I'll look forward to talking to you soon.